the bull and the wires in the head. And then I told Danny at the end of this process, they found out they didn't need wires, they didn't need chips, they could do it with light. And he goes, what? That is the last part of the story that nobody seems to understand. So they begin to realize that they can use light frequencies to destroy the leptin melanocortin pathways in the brain to control people. They don't need LSD, they don't need mescaline, they don't need anything else, okay? And the reason why this program gets changed is during its evolution, they find out that people that have heavily melanated skin are the most difficult to control, okay? So there's another DARPA program that you may have heard about. I'm sure Whitney Webb and Mark Godwin have heard about it, but have never linked it to this story. It's called the Targeted Individual Program. In other words, how you control people utilizing remote technology. Well, who's the guy that actually really discovered this whole thing? Alan Fry. Alan Fry's looked at a good guy in my world. Why? He's the first guy that showed that when you zap a brain with any type of electromagnetic radiation, it opens the blood-brain barrier. So you can take bad shit and get it in. What magically happens in the United States at that time? People start making processed food. What also magically happens? Drugs start to come on market, and they have a lot of fillers and preservatives in them. Guess what all those fillers and preservatives and all the fake processed shit was really about? It was about figuring out how to get toxins from your gut into your brain so that you could electromagnetically target them. That is actually what happens between MK Ultra into SRI. What do they find out in SRI? Where does the program stall? 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. That's magically when Obama says we're going to get rid of incandescent bulbs, we're going to go to LEDs. What do they find out? Because LED bulbs remove UV and red light, have a huge blue spike. It turns out the blue spike can actually be used to control people through the dopamine pathway. How does that work? If you go back and listen carefully to what I said to Danny, and he clearly didn't get it, even though he's done podcasts with people that told him this in the past. Dopamine, or I should say melanin, breaks down into dopamine. If you open the blood-brain barrier, dopamine floods the brain and it causes brain damage. Anybody who's a healthcare practitioner, I guarantee you, when Kevin listens to this, he'll understand it, knows that when we use dopamine in an ICU setting, we have to be extremely careful with it, when we're trying to elevate their blood pressure, because a low dose, a medium dose, or a high dose can kill you. When people are in the ICU, they're around electromagnetic devices. This is the reason why. Because we're flooding their brain with dopamine, we're flooding their brain with serotonin. There's even something called the serotonin syndrome that y'all can look up and fact check Uncle Jack. This is the key things that Alan Fry finds out for DARPA. And then what does DARPA originally do? Not only are they using directed energy weapons to try to control this, they are now checking this at scale in the United States. So what two things happen at the end of Obama's term that you guys may remember that's tied to this story? There is two things that happen. The first thing is a young African-American attorney who went to Florida State named Myron May goes into the Florida State Library with a gun, shoots the library up, doesn't shoot anybody else. And what does he do? He sends 10 people a package with the story of what I'm telling you right now. And he says, I know they're targeting me, but I don't know why. How did this all start? It's a very interesting story when you delve into it. He's comes from a poor background, had no medical problems. He had a Fitzpatrick score of 4. He wasn't like Nairobi, Kenya, but pretty dark. He starts to date a pediatrician from New Mexico. And magically, after they're dating for a while, he starts to complain of horrible back pain around his kidney and adrenal gland. He starts telling her, I think I need to go to the doctor. She goes, no, just treat it this way, that way. He goes to see a doctor in New Mexico who's a known entity in the DARPA program. He gets prescribed medications for ADHD. The pediatrician goes, why in the hell would they put you on something like this? What happens from there? He goes back to Florida. His behavior becomes more bizarre. He's telling people that he hears voices in his head. He has horrible pain in his chest and he doesn't know why. Ultimately, something happens to him where he figures out that somebody from the outside is actually targeting him for a reason and he doesn't know why. Here's the key part of the story, Marty. Turns out when you have a lot of melanin both inside and outside your body, this direct targeting device is bidirectional. See, when you don't have a lot of melanin, when they shoot it into you, you actually become a zombie, an obedient idiot. But when you're highly melanated, because what does melanin do? It absorbs massive amounts of radiation. For those of you who don't believe this, you can actually go look at the tests that we did on the hydrogen bomb, okay, on the atolls in the South Pacific. You may be shocked to hear this, but when we did that test, the United States military didn't even know what the thermonuclear capability of the bomb was that they were going to set off. Turned out they thought it was going to be about 7.5 megatons. It turned out, reality of the test, it was 15 megatons. That means that the blast area went into areas where regular people from the South Pacific lived. There's pictures that show these people lost their melanin in certain places on their body. You know why? Because that melanin absorbed the radiation blast for them. Okay? That's documented out there. So the government begins to realize that if they're going to use these devices as a weapon of war, that they've got to test it at scale on different folks. Turned out all the stuff that you hear about the TI people that are out there, these are people that are the randomized controlled clinical trial of DARPA on their own people before this weapon is ready for prime time. Just so you know, Marty, you may be asking, well, the Russians had the same technology as us. Why don't we see the same program there? Well, the Russians try to warn us. And this is where Becker's research comes in. Do you know, and you can look this up, there used to be something called the woodpecker frequency that emanted from Ukraine that went all the way around the globe at a specific latitude. This was an EMF device that the Russians put out to warn the United States that if you guys don't change what you're doing in terms of adopting electromagnetic radiation through cell technology, you're going to create a huge problem for people. And then when the United States military didn't listen to them, what did Russia do? This is where the Moscow embassy event happens. Remember, you probably heard as a young man about Havana syndrome, where all these guys in Cuba got zapped, right? You probably don't remember learning anything about what happened in the Moscow embassy. The Russians took a pulse microwave device and pointed it at the US embassy in Moscow from 1967 all the way to 1973. In that time frame, they had more diagnoses of tinnitus, Meniere syndrome, voices, mental illness, but here's the big one. We had 3 straight ambassadors develop blood cancers. Okay? Turns out in 1973, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, has to give hazard pay to anybody who was in the embassy at that time. Do you know how they solved the problem? You want to know where the idea of tinfoil hats came from, my friend? They put tinfoil all up in the U.S. embassy when they found out what the Russians were doing. And what did the Russians tell them? We're trying to warn you that what you're about to do is going to be a big problem. 1973, Marty, guess what else happens in 1973? Becker does the key paper on the sanguine antenna to use RF radiation pulsed to check all the Trident submarines all over. And he finds out through his work that this is a huge problem. So the Secretary of Navy and the other parts of DARPA know that this is a big issue because they're working on both parts of this story. So Becker gets so frustrated from 73 to 77, kind of like Kevin was about his story that you've been documenting with him every time you have him on. And he goes on 60 Minutes and tells the world the truth. Guess what happens to him? He gets fucking Bernice Eddied. Literally, they take all his money away. How do you censor a scientist? You just take their money away. And basically, a guy that's twice nominated for the Nobel Prize for his work in tissue regeneration, utilizing bioelectricity gets zapped. Why? Also, the government continue this DARPA program that then gets morphed in 2008, first to get rid of incandescents and then to put LEDs, then it gets even more nefarious. Obama says we need to figure out how to get brown people more controlled. So they pick Central and South America. Why? They've got a good mix of Fitzpatrick's 2s, 3s, and 4s. They go down there and they start to perfect the targeting. What are they using to deliver the targets? They're using processed food. They're using jabs. They're using geoengineering. Things fall from the sky. And you may be saying, well, how does this really work, Jack? Like, what's the mechanism that's tied to it? This is where you don't get any of the Whitney Webb, Mark Godwin people understanding. When you open someone's brain blood barrier and you open up their gut barrier, that means that big toxins, higher atomic mass than a hydrogen proton, goes into places that it's not supposed to be. So, Marty, you're a smart guy. I think you know that Intel and AMD, when they make semiconductors, they have clean rooms, right? They don't want anything in there. Turns out your brain works on the same mechanism. How do we know that? Guess what Becker's work was on? He's the one that proves that our body works by semiconduction. They already took his research out. So what did the government do? They take high atomic mass elements and deliver them in ways that you can't imagine. How does this work, Marty? You have places in your body called the circumventricular organs. And remember, I'm a Bitcoiner, but what's my day job? I'm a brain surgeon. So I know a little bit something about the brain. The circumventricular organs sit around your hypothalamus and your thalamus. These are areas where you never have a blood-brain barrier. These become the target of DARPA. They start to deliver these things. Do you want to know why geoengineering really is a problem? Not only does it block the sun, but when this shit falls down in the ground, those elements wind up going through places where you don't have a blood-brain barrier. And if they can convince you to use those earphones that Apple sells, then they can really get you because it lets tons of stuff in. So all the keto snacks that all the food gurus want to sell you has nothing to do with the food. It has to do with all the shit that they put in there that's manufactured that has a higher atomic weight than should. What's the issue with drugs? Everybody knows the story about Columbine and every other school shooter, but you've never put it together. It's not the SSRI drug, it's the fillers and preservatives in it that are a problem. Here comes the big one, Marty. This is something Kevin didn't find out, but I'm going to tell you. We find out that every jab, not just the Pfizer one, every single one out there, including the one that was used in China, has 51 to 55 elements that are not supposed to be in there. You want to find out the really interesting part? All jabs have 100% chromium in them. Do you know why they pick chromium? It has a +6 oxidation state. What does that mean? Negative to +3. That means it's a much more tunable atom when it interacts with electromagnetic radiation. Want to hear something even crazier? Chromium isn't found in every single drug that Big Pharma makes. Did you know that?
I did not.
Right. So it gets better. You remember Aaron Brockovich? Remember the story about PG&E? What was the element that caused cancer in the people out there around their power lines and that place? Hexavalent chromium. Isn't that interesting, huh, Marty? So you got the story of these high atomic elements with non-native EMF, and it's always associated with these unusual diseases that humans are getting. This is the collateral effects of the bioweapons program. But it turns out, what DARPA finds out, is that the people that have the darkest skin are difficult to control. So why did I have to be careful with Huberman? Did you know that Huberman's father was a condensed matter physicist at Stanford? You know what that means? He studies things like melanin. I was concerned that Huberman's father was part of this program, and that's the reason I really didn't want to go and talk to him. You know what else Huberman is famous for studying? Cephalopods. You know what cephalopods use to get away? Ink. You know what the ink is made out of? Melanin. I didn't know if Huberman knew more than I thought he did. I found out that he's a fucking idiot. Okay. So that was a good thing, but he never put two and two together. But guess what? When you look up Fry syndrome or microwave syndrome, you'll find out that I'm exactly right, that they can use pulse microwave to make voices in your head. And you know what the irony is when you talk to people who have had this problem? I've talked to so many soldiers with this problem. They have actually heard people voices coming from the center of their head. Do you know why? Because that's where the thalamus is emitting the antenna signals. So guess what? The people that have melanin in their brain, they're the ones that actually can harm the government. The government they want to stay completely clandestine and covert. That's the reason why people need to upgrade their melanin systems. It makes you more resistant to this. So if you want to keep your seed phrases clean 30 years from now, if you're one of those people that keeps it in your head, then you better make sure that you live inside the tropics and that you're outside like a rotisserie chicken. I'm going to tell you, the people that have to worry the most are people that lived in geoengineered cities. If you want to know the reason why the cities are being geoengineered, remember, if you don't use processed food, if you don't use supplements, if you don't use drugs, what's the next way to get you? Geoengineer it, the shit falls out of the sky and goes right in the ethmoid sinus, in the roof of your nose where your pituitary has no blood-brain barrier. Dude, they have thought of it all. They're that good. And some of these people that came back from the theater at this military base, I used to take CSF samples from them, and I would send them to a place, not to do an MRI of their brain. I do nuclear magnetic resonance of their CSF to look for those atoms. Guess what? I didn't see one person that came back with PTSD that didn't have those atoms in their CSF. So, Marty, you want to take a guess now why Uncle Jack lives in El Salvador?
Increase that melanin.
You want to take a guess why the FBI, CIA, and DARPA has been to visit Uncle Jack a lot in the last 10 or 12 years? They wanted to know exactly what I told you in this podcast. They wanted to know how much I knew. Well, guess what? Now you know why I didn't want to go talk to Rick and Huberman. Because when you allow this shit to come out, dude, it's not a good place to be. Remember what Voltaire said? When you start to talk against the people in power, it's a huge issue. And am I worried about it? Yeah. Now I know that the globalists, the people in DARPA, are now coming to El Salvador. You don't believe it? Remember the adopting Bitcoin meeting that we had here in November?
Mm-hmm.
Sergey Brin magically turned my feed off. I was the only person that got turned off from the stage.
Holy shit. That was a truth nuke. So this is why they have made people think sun is dangerous. This is the real reason why. They don't want people out in the nature. Holy ball sacks of raw chicken. Uncle Jack with the base to the bone knowledge. Fuck. That was good. What do you think about it? I think about this explains a lot. This explains a whole lot.